Good afternoon. I am so sorry. I was running a few minutes late. Traffic was a little thicker coming up 85 than I anticipated. So my sincerest apologies. But are y'all having a good conference so far? Yeah. Nice to come to Athens and do something a little different. Yeah. Well, like Christopher was saying, I'm Mazi Robinson. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the Atlanta area. I have been practicing for 16 years, so my practice can drive now. And I specialize in self-worth, self-esteem concerns, relationship concerns, and life stage transitions. I also have a counseling practice where we work with adult women on a variety of concerns, depression and anxiety, trauma, addiction, recovery, divorce recovery, and we provide virtual counseling for individuals across the state of Georgia. So if I can ever be of assistance with a referral in your area, please feel free to reach out. But I am so excited. In addition to counseling, I get to do a lot of fun things like this and talk to awesome people like y'all. I am so excited today to be back with y'all. Thank you for having me last year, but I'm excited to be back with y'all today and to talk about a topic that I am really passionate about and that I love talking about, which is relationships and how to have healthy relationships and what boundaries look like in those relationships. So if it's okay with y'all, I'm just gonna dive right in, all right? So to kick us off, I wanted us to just start thinking about different relationships in our lives. So just take a minute and you can close your eyes or you can keep your eyes open. And think about a relationship that you find difficult. This person just kind of gets under your skin. They just grate on your nerves a little bit. You find them annoying, right? Okay. Now think about a relationship that is stressful. When you're around this person, you just feel stressed, You feel anxious. Maybe you even dread being around this person, dread those interactions. Maybe this person has hurt you. That's the source of the dread. And then think of a relationship in which you feel resentful, in which you feel that the relationship is not balanced, it's not mutual, it's not reciprocal. Maybe you even feel a little bitter. Hopefully, our lives aren't only filled with these type of relationships and people, but chances are some names quickly pop to your head for each of those types of relationships. Whether in our personal or our professional lives, we are always going to encounter people that bug us, that frustrate us, stress us out, that annoy us, right? And as much as we are wired for connection, and we all have different need levels for connection, but we are wired for connection. We need connection in order to be mentally and emotionally well. We have seen that over the past few years, specifically. As much as we are wired for connection, as we all know, connection is not always easy. It's not always seamless. So today, let me find these arrow buttons so I can get comfortable here. So today, I am going to give you the secret to having healthier relationships. What you can do to have healthier relationships in your professional life and in your personal life so that you are not feeling as bothered by people in your life, so that your relationships are more life-giving, more balanced, and healthier. Are you ready for the secret?
Yes.
It's just going to change your life. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So the secret is this. When we learn to set boundaries, we can hold on to who we want to be, the person we want to be, how we want to show up in this world. And with those boundaries, we can practice empathy and kindness towards others, regardless of the person or the situation. And so that really is the secret to healthier relationships. In a very simplified sentence, when we learn to set boundaries, we can hold on to who we want to be, and we can practice genuine kindness and empathy. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, I don't want to be kind and empathetic. That's just not who I am. And one of the things that I have found is that whenever I begin talking about empathy in a professional setting, I always get a little pushback. I always get a lot of pushback. Because inevitably someone is thinking, or they will raise their hand and share this feedback, well, so are you just saying I have to go soft and I just have to roll over? I just have to empathize and empathize and empathize. But when can I say we got to get stuff done? We have deadlines. We have to move on with life, right? That's often what people think. People often think, well, empathy and boundaries don't go together. You either have boundaries or you have empathy. But this afternoon, we're going to look at how not only do empathy and compassion and kindness and boundaries go together, but they must go together. And in fact, we cannot have one without the other in any of our relationships. So let's start off by just defining what a boundary is. Boundaries show where I end and you begin, right? They help me see what is my part, what is my responsibility, what is my side of the yard, so to speak, and then what is your part? What is your responsibility? What is your side of the yard? They are the line between you and me. We are created to have boundaries. And in fact, if you look at all of nature and creation, everything has a boundary, right? Skin is a boundary. Trees have boundary, the tree bark, right? Rivers have boundaries, the riverbank. Everything has a boundary because boundaries create containment. Boundaries create safe containment. Now, for all the information out there, and there are lots of books out there about boundaries, lots of Instagram accounts about boundaries, for all the information out there about boundaries, there is an equal amount of misinformation and misconceptions about boundaries. And so I thought it might be helpful to just kind of go through some of those common misconceptions about boundaries so that we are all on the same page, so to speak. So misconception number one, when we think about boundaries, a lot of us immediately think, well, I'm gonna set some boundaries, and so that means I'm gonna cut them off. I'm not gonna talk to them anymore. I'm going to walk away from this. I'm going to end this thing in my life, right? That's what we often think of when we think of boundaries. But a boundary does not necessarily mean disconnection. A boundary does not necessarily mean disconnection. Ending a relationship, stepping back from a relationship, stepping away from something, that is a type of boundary, but that is not the end-all be-all of what a boundary is. And this is, again, where a lot of us get tripped up, because when we start thinking about boundaries, it's very easy for us to fall into some all-or-nothing thinking, like, I have to stay in this relationship and this job until I take my last breath, or I'm out of here and I'm never looking back, right? But there's a lot in between those two options in your life. So what are some examples of healthy boundaries that are in between those two options? Well, for example, a boundary could be deciding to talk to a parent who drinks too much before 5 o'clock in the afternoon. A boundary could be deciding not going to a networking event that you really never enjoy. A boundary could be changing your expectations of someone and calibrating your actions accordingly. A boundary could be speaking your needs and giving your opinion. A boundary could be deciding you're not going to talk to certain people about certain things. A boundary could be deciding how many volunteer activities you're going to volunteer for between now and June, right? So boundaries are not walls that cut off connection. They are fences with gates. And we open and close the gate whenever we need to, depending on what is going on, depending on the circumstances. Boundaries allow us to engage in relationships and environments to the degree that work for us and ensure our sense of safety. When we feel that an environment or a person is safe, we can open the gate. When we feel that perhaps things are not as healthy as they could be, we can close the gate. But it's a fence with a gate. It's not a wall. So how do we know when we actually need to set boundaries in our life? For a lot of people, this is a big question. I don't know. How do I know I need boundaries? How do I know that? So, and this is where self-awareness is really, really helpful. And I know y'all talked yesterday, I believe, about emotional intelligence. And last year I was here talking about self-awareness and emotional intelligence. And this is one of those areas of life where we do want to be emotionally and self-aware. We must be aware of how we are experiencing a person or an environment and be aware of those feelings, because those feelings are trying to tell us something, right? The anxiety you feel in a meeting is trying to tell you something. The frustration and annoyance you feel is trying to tell you something. The resentment and the overwhelm you feel is trying to tell you something. And so we want to be aware that we are feeling those things. This relationship is not good for you. This person is toxic and disrespectful. You are angry for a reason, right? And so we want to be aware when our feelings are trying to signal, woohoo, something's going on here. So what are some signs that we need healthy boundaries in our life? If we notice that we do a lot of people pleasing, like we always put ourselves on the backest burner possible, right? And everything and everyone else comes first. If we notice we're making a lot of excuses for someone, minimizing their behavior, rationalizing, making a lot of excuses. Anytime there is the presence of disrespect or abuse, that is a sign that we need some healthy boundaries in that relationship. When the relationship is imbalanced and it is not mutual and reciprocal, and the other person is under functioning, not pulling their load, that's a sign that we need healthy boundaries. If we start to feel trapped in a relationship, right? I'm stuck. That's a sign that we could benefit from some healthy boundaries. Any sort of unhealthy behaviors like rage and addiction, those always call for some healthy boundaries. If we are feeling overworked, if we are feeling overwhelmed, if we feel like the world is on our shoulders and it's all up to us and we're the ones who are responsible and we can't stop because we're going to let everybody down, that's a sign we need healthy boundaries. And then if we're feeling bitter and resentful, that's a sign. And so if any of these are present, we may need to figure out how to build a fence with a gate, right? So misconception 1, boundaries mean we cut off. That's a misconception. The truth is boundaries are a fence with a gate and we open and close it when we need to. Misconception number 2, we think we set boundaries to change the other person. That is what a lot of people think the purpose of boundaries are. It is to change this person who needs to change, right? Because they are the problem, right? You are under functioning and I am telling you, you are not pulling your load. I'm setting a boundary with you and you're going to change now and our relationship's going to be better, right? So many of us fall into that misconception. But that's not the purpose of setting a boundary in a relationship. Boundaries are not for the other person. Boundaries are about us, and they are for us. Our boundaries protect and safeguard our worth and well-being. That is the purpose of a boundary. That is what boundaries do. That's why we set them, to protect our worth and our well-being. Boundaries are not for the other person. They are not meant to change or control the other person. They are for us, to protect us and who we are and who we want to be. So let me give you an example of this, okay? So let's say that you and I were sitting across from one another, okay? And we're both sitting down, and your leg is crossed, and you start, kind of doing your leg like this, kicking your leg like this, and you kick my shin, and I say, oh, ow, I think you accidentally kicked my shin, but you kept doing it, right? You just, like the Rockettes, like you're just kicking away. And I'm like, ow, oh, you're still kicking my shin. Can you stop kicking my shin? You're still kicking my shin. And I say, okay, you're really hurting me now. Please stop kicking my shin. Yes, I want you to stop kicking my shin. And yes, I have asked you to stop kicking my shin. And I have even told you, you are hurting me because you are kicking my shin. And yes, it is certainly worth pondering, why are you continuing to kick my shin? But I can't make you stop kicking my shin. I can't make you stop kicking me. I can only control and change myself. I can't control if you change, but I can control what I expose myself to. So the boundary is not stop kicking my leg. That's actually a request or even a demand, but it's not a boundary. The boundary is, I see you are continuing to choose to kick my leg. So I am going to choose to get up and move, right? That's the boundary. The boundary is to protect my worth and my well-being, not to change you. Years ago, I had a client that we talked a lot about boundaries in her life. And I remember she said, I've never had boundaries in my life before because I never believed there was anything worth protecting. And it was a profoundly insightful statement. And there's a direct correlation between our sense of worth and our comfort level with setting boundaries. When we know our worth, we are more comfortable to say, this is not good for my worth and well-being. And I now have to make some choices to protect my worth and my well-being. So the boundary is, what am I going to do to protect my worth and my well-being? Because I can't control you. The boundary is not outward facing. It's not around the other person. The boundary is inward facing. It's around me, so to speak. Does that make sense what I'm saying there? Yeah. I can't control if you kick me, but I can control if I'm sitting in the path of your kicking leg. I can control what I expose myself to. A boundary, again, is what are we going to do to keep ourselves safe, to keep ourselves regulated and in control based on what we are presently experiencing. We are the gatekeepers to our well-being. As adults, we have agency and control. And I'm going to pause now and just go on a little bit of a tangent here that is not related to this, but hopefully we'll have time. As adults, we have agency and control. And one of the things that I often find, and this is going deep for a second, but I feel compelled to say it. One of the things that I often find with adults who are survivors of child abuse is that one of the things they wrestle with is why didn't I speak up? Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I tell anyone? Why didn't I try to stop it? And the thing that we have to remember is that children do not have agency, power, or control. They don't. And so when someone is mistreating them, whatever that may look like in their life, they don't have agency, power, and control because they are a child. And so as an adult, you can't look back on whatever may have happened in your childhood and go, why didn't I do that? Why didn't I get up and leave? Why didn't I change seats? Why didn't I leave the room? You didn't have that power, agency, and control. You didn't. But as adults, we have to remember, I have power, agency, and control. I always have power, agency, and control. I can always do what I need to do to protect my worth and my well-being. And we use that power and agency to control what we can control, which is ourselves, and to control what we expose ourselves to. Does that make sense? That what I'm trying to say there about the difference between when we're children and now as adults. And so this is why learning how and when to set boundaries is actually empowering for us. because boundaries help us reclaim, or if for some of us, they help us discover our power to unhitch ourselves from someone else's behavior so that we are back in the driver's seat of our lives and we have control over our feelings, over our reactions, over our decisions, over our environment. And then at some point, if the inappropriate behavior, hurtful behavior, whatever it is, continues, then we do need to look at, okay, what's going on here in this relationship? Is this a good, et cetera, obviously. Okay, so that was misconception 2. Misconception number 3. Once we set a boundary, once I've set a boundary, it is the other person's job to respect the boundary. It is the other person's job to uphold it. That's another misconception we have about boundaries. Yes, people need to respect our boundaries. And yes, in mutual, reciprocal, healthy relationships, we respect one another's boundaries. And let me also just pause for a second and say this. In instances of physical and sexual assault, the no is the no and you respect the no. So what I'm saying here does not apply to that. I'm talking more of just relational concerns and dynamics, okay? So I want to give that caveat. So yes, people need to respect our boundaries, and that happens in mutual, reciprocal, and healthy relationships. But regardless, it is our job to uphold our boundaries. It is our job. So that means that it's our responsibility. The reality is, it is their choice to respect our boundaries. It is our responsibility to uphold them. So again, the boundary is not, you can't talk to me that way. You can't yell at me like that. That's not a boundary. That's a statement, actually. The boundary is, if you choose to call me names, if you choose to speak to me disrespectfully, if you choose to yell at me, I am going to take a time out and get up and walk out of the room, and we can continue the discussion tomorrow, right? That's the boundary. What am I going to do to protect my worth and well-being? Too often, what I hear from people, I hear people say, well, I told them to stop doing it, and I told them, that they needed to pull their load, that they needed to change, and nothing changed. So, what do I do now? You uphold the boundary, right? You do what you need to do to protect your needs, your energy, your worth, your well-being. We cannot wait for someone else to respect our boundaries or allow whether or not someone respects our boundaries to be a sign that we're going to stick with them, right? Does that make sense? We can't wait for their approval of our boundary. And so this leads to one of the hard truths about boundaries in relationships. Boundaries are going to require us oftentimes to make changes in our own lives that we really don't want to make, right? But what if I don't want to get up and move seats? I like that chair, right? So let's put this in a work example. And I'm sure this example does not apply to anyone here. So we're just talking about other people, right? Other people. Okay, so let's say that your boss never acknowledges you, never acknowledges your contributions. Your boss takes credit for your work and is just kind of a toxic person, right? You've gone to HR, you've tried different approaches with the boss, nothing has changed. You go home every single day feeling defeated and dejected. But at the same time, you love your coworkers. You love them. Y'all have a great time together, right? You even have book club and go to lunch together, right? You love your coworkers and you don't want to give up those relationships. So what do you do, right? You got this boss that's kind of killing your soul, but you love your coworkers. When someone repeatedly shows us who they are, right? That's that famous Maya Angelou quote. When someone repeatedly shows us who they are, we have to believe them. And we have to make changes in our life accordingly. And in this instance, your boss has repeatedly shown you who they are. And so, yes, you are faced with a very tough decision. You can stay and work in the toxicity, knowing there is no present evidence that anything is going to change. Or You can make the hard decision to change jobs and trust that you'll stay in touch with your coworkers who you dearly love. But if someone is doing what they've always done, we can't be surprised when they continue to be who they've shown us to be, right? And I'm sure some of you might be thinking, but I don't want to change, right? I don't want to move seats. I don't want to do something differently. I don't want to have to look for a job. Why should I be the one to have to go through all the stress and the angst and the work and the blah, 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 when they're the problem? They're the ones who need to change. And I can tell you 20 people who would agree with me, right? Exactly. And I totally get that. And in fact, well, okay, that's another tangent. I'm going to stick to when we keep waiting for someone to change, what happens is that we end up experiencing the consequences of their actions. When we keep waiting for someone to change, we end up experiencing the consequences of their actions. What do those consequences look like in our lives? They look like anxiety, and they look like not being able to sleep, losing our appetite, or overeating, feeling nervous all the time, wanting to numb, feeling stressed, feeling overwhelmed. But by setting and upholding your boundary, you are taking ownership of what you need, your safety and well-being, rather than sitting in resentment and anger every night. The person may not change, but you can change, and how you feel can change. And this leads to a point that we often don't hear a lot about when it comes to setting boundaries in our lives. And it's this, that boundaries often involve grief. And a lot of people never name that, but it's the truth. Boundary setting often involves grief. And that's one of the reasons it's really hard for us to set boundaries in our life, because as human beings, we will do everything we can to resist grieving. We do not like the feeling of grief in our lives. And so we don't want to admit that this person, this relationship, this job isn't who we want them to be. It isn't going to turn out the way that we want it to turn out. And so what happens is it often just feels more comfortable to stay angry and resentful than to fall into that vulnerable sadness of grieving and realizing, gosh, this parent is never going to change. They are who they are. My boss is never going to change. My friend is never going to see how their comments are hurtful to me. You know, hope is a wonderful thing. And we have to have hope in our lives. It's actually very important to our mental well-being. But we have to have realistic hope. And realistic hope is rooted in this truth, which is the best predictor of future behavior is past and present behavior. And so we have to have that realistic hope. And which means that sometimes we do have to release, we do have to surrender. And that is hard. But and that's grief. That's genuine grief. But what we have to remember is that there is freedom on the other side. There may still be sadness. You may grieve that, gosh, I really wanted that to work out differently. But there is freedom from the resentment, from the stress, from the anxiety, from the anger. And there is an opportunity for us to reclaim our self and our sense of peace. And I think it's just important that we name that there is that element of grief and grieving when we feel it necessary to set boundaries in our life. So now we are going to take a slight turn in our discussion here, and we're going to look at boundaries from a different angle. Okay, so we're veering, all right? We're getting off on another exit, if you will. So often we are reluctant to set boundaries because we don't want to seem unkind, right? I don't want to be mean. I don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want to be rude, right? We don't want to appear uncaring or selfish, like all the things that we say, right? But here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. And we've already kind of touched on this, but I'm just going to say it explicitly. The longer we engage without boundaries, the more we will start to feel bitter, resentful, judgmental, critical, etc. And when we start to feel all of that, it is hard, if not impossible, for us then to be genuinely kind and empathetic to others. Brene Brown says the most compassionate people are the most boundaried. Said another way, again, as we said, boundaries protect our worth and well-being, and they do that by protecting us from unsafe people and situations. But boundaries also protect us from resentment and bitterness and judgment and anger. They protect us from these things so that we can practice genuine kindness, compassion, and empathy towards others. So let me give you a real life example of what I mean by this turn we're making here in our discussion about boundaries. So a friend told me this story. My friend is a senior member in her office, okay? And about a year ago, they hired a new guy. And she really advocated to hire this new guy. She really liked him. She thought he would be a great addition to the team. So, she was really like, let's hire him. Yeah. So they hired him. But once he started, he and the business owner kind of clashed a little bit. They didn't communicate well with one another, didn't get along with one another. And so my friend, feeling kind of responsible that she had really advocated to hire this fella, and then also being someone who likes to be kind and likes to help, right? She kind of got involved. And so she started kind of trying to mediate between the new guy, we'll call him John, and the business owner, we'll call him Jim. And so she kept trying to mediate between John and Jim, and what you have to understand about Jim is, and I think if you would do this with John, right, you can kind of see how that was playing out, all right? And eventually John and Jim started to get along better, right? So good. So then recently, she was talking to John, the new guy, she was talking with John, and John was, kind of commenting about, he was just feeling a little frustrated because he and Jim had talked about this thing, and he thought they were going to go with X, but now it appears they're going to go with Y, which is what Jim wanted to do, and so he was just feeling kind of frustrated by it, right? So my friend texted Jim, the business owner, and John, the three of them on a text. And she said, hey, Jim, I was sitting here talking to John, and he mentioned that y'all had discussed blah, blah, and he thought y'all were going to do X, but it looks like you're going to do Y. So, what's going on here? And Jim, the business owner, said, okay, I'll look into it. And so then, like a few minutes later, several minutes later, she noticed that John, the new guy, was texting, and she just something in her is like, I think he's texting with Jim. And so she said, hey, what are you doing? And he said, I'm just texting. And she said, hey, are you texting John without me? Or Jim, business owner? And John kind of sheepishly said, yeah. And so my friend admitted, but in that moment, I felt very unappreciated. I felt left out. I felt resentful. I felt bitter. And I felt really irritated. So let's unpack this example, okay? So my friend was trying to be helpful and kind, right? But in the end, she was left feeling resentful and unappreciated, right? So where did the wheels fall off the car in this story? Well, you could say they fell off right at the beginning when she tried to mediate between Jim and John, right? But they really fell off when she texted, right? Like that was like then out, everything's out of the car at that point when she texted. And so this is just a great example of having good intentions, but not having good boundaries, right? And we all can kind of, maybe we've been there before, or we can think of someone who falls in that category. Great intentions, lovely intentions, but not great boundaries. And so, this whole idea of not having good boundaries, it can look like kind of the stereotypical image of, being a doormat, never saying no, people pleasing, doing anything to keep the peace, not standing up for yourself. Like, yes, those are all examples of not having good boundaries. But not having good boundaries can also look like over functioning, overstepping, always trying to help, fix, and save, right? Picking up things that don't belong to you, taking on responsibilities that are not yours. And in my experience, what I have observed is that this is the main cause of a lot of frustration, bitterness, and resentment we feel in our relationships. In our effort to be kind and helpful, right, we end up feeling anything but kind. We end up feeling frustrated and resentful and unappreciated. So, what does boundary setting look like in these instances, in these types of relationships? How do we begin to set boundaries, quite frankly, with ourselves, right? And so the answer is we learn to practice empathy, all right? And so this is where we find that intersection between empathy and boundaries. And so let me just give you a quick down and dirty on what empathy is. So, and you'll see, as I talk about what empathy is, you'll see how the intersection, it'll get clearer to you. It'll come into focus, if you will. So empathy is a non-judgmental acknowledgement of someone else's experience. A non-judgmental acknowledgement of someone else's experience. Empathy says, I see you, I hear you, I want to understand more. Empathy does not require agreement. You do not have to agree with the way this person is feeling to empathize with them. You do not have to agree with the decision they made that got them into this predicament. You do not have to agree with their perception of the situation to empathize with them. You also do not have to have experienced what they are experiencing, right? Because when we empathize with someone, we're not connecting over the lived experience, the life experience. We are connecting over the emotion, right? So let's say that a friend of yours is going through a divorce. Perhaps you have never been divorced, but you have felt sad, and you have felt rejected, and you have felt lonely, and you have perhaps felt betrayed in your life. And so you are connecting with that person over the emotional experience, not the actual details of the lived experience, right? So again, going back to the whole idea of agreement, you can empathize with someone and not agree with their perception of the situation, but you hear that they're very sad. So I hear the sadness, right? So empathy is a non-judgmental acknowledgement of someone else's emotional experience. Empathy is not advice giving, fixing, problem solving, right? That's not empathy. Well, have you tried? Well, have you thought about? Have you looked into? You really should. All of those, right? And I think this is where a lot of us get tripped up, because why am I giving you advice and trying to problem solve you? It's because I'm trying to be kind, right? I'm just trying to love you and take care of you and support you. And so I'm going to tell you what to do and who you need to call and what article you need to read, right? Exactly. But people don't want to be fixed. They want to be heard. And that's the gift of empathy, is that someone feels seen and heard by our presence with them. And so people, they actually don't want the advice. They don't want the problem solving. And if you want to drill down into that a little deeper, one of the reasons, the reason that we fall into the advice giving, problem solving, fixing, saving, helping is because we ourselves feel uncomfortable in the situation. So if I can just tell you what to do so that you can get wrapped up with a bow and you are no longer distressed, and I then I don't have to be uncomfortable by your distress, then it's just all better, right? And so we fix and problem solve out of our own discomfort with the situation, right? But advice giving, fixing, problem solving, that's not being empathetic, right? And it's not communicating, I see you, I hear you. Empathy is not emotionally correcting. Well, at least, right? Well, car broke down and my dog has cancer and my sister's not speaking to me. Well, at least you have a roof over your head. A lot of people in the world can't say that right now. Right. We have all fallen into the trap of giving the at least statement. And again, we give it because we feel comfortable and we don't know what to say. So we just want to wrap it on up, right? But we have also been victim to the at least statement. And when someone gives you an at least statement, how do you feel? Terrible. And what happens to the conversation? It's done so, right? You change the subject, right? Or you just kind of stop talking and the other person starts talking. So if there's anything that you take away from today, the thing that I hope you take away is a commitment not to use at least, right? Because it is not communicating, I see you, I hear you, right? It is a conversation stopper. It is not our job to give other people perspective. That's often why we do the at least thing. Well, I'm just trying to help them see, the silver line and the perspective. It's not our job to give other people perspective. It is everyone's individual job to find their own perspective. And lastly, empathy is not cheerleading. This is going to be fine. You're going to be okay. You're going to knock this out of the park. You just have to choose joy. Just and write a gratitude list. Yeah, it's going to be okay. It's not our job to cheerlead people into better moods, right? That's not being empathetic. It's not our job to tell them to look on the bright side. In fact, when we step into that cheerleader mode, in a lot of ways, we're violating their boundary. Because when we step into cheerleader mode, what we're doing is we're denying them their reality. Their reality in that moment is that things are hard and this sucks. And right. And so it's actually a little bit of an example of a covert boundary violation, if you will. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of the cheerleading statements, you actually don't feel supported in that moment. You feel dismissed. So then what does empathy sound like? If empathy is not advice giving, problem solving, fixing, if it's not emotional correcting, and if it's not cheerleading, what does it actually sound like? It sounds like this. It sounds like you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed by the recent changes. You're dealing with a lot of uncertainty right now. That's got to be hard and anxiety inducing. I'm sorry you're having to walk through this. Tell me more about what's going on. I notice you've been talking a lot about some upcoming deadlines. I wonder if you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed right now at work. How can I be of support? Empathy is not life-changing wisdom. It is simply communicating, I see you where you are right now. And truly, truly, there is no greater gift that you can give than empathy. In our conversations, there's no greater gift that we can give than empathy. You will never err by leading with empathy in a conversation. And particularly if you lead a team, empathy is so important. It creates trust, it creates safety in the team environment. So how is all this connecting to what we're talking about with boundaries? So in our example with my friend, right, let's go back to the friend. What would have practicing empathy and having healthy boundaries, what would that have looked like in that situation? So when the new guy, John, I think we named him, when the new guy started to kind of complain, I thought it was going to be this, but it's going to be this. My friend could have said, I'm sorry, that sounds really frustrating. If she really, 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 really wanted to be helpful, she could have said, I'm sorry, that sounds frustrating. Can I help in any way? Right? Notice the empathy and kindness. She acknowledges his dismay, right? Notice the empathy and kindness. She acknowledges his dismay. And then notice the boundary. The boundary is the empathy followed by she asks if she can help, right?
She opened the gate.
I'm sorry?
She opened the gate.
Oh my word. Yes. You hear that? It's fantastic, right? Yeah, right, exactly. And that boundary of asking is how she keeps herself from overstepping. So she's honoring her boundary where I am against. She's honoring his boundary right there. And so, but also what we see here, I'm sorry, that sounds so frustrating. Can I be of help in any way? What we see here is that actually when we, coming back to the work environment, when we empathize with someone, you're not rolling over. You're not just saying, oh, anything goes. You know, you're not rolling over. You're not letting people get away with things. You are acknowledging their experience. And by doing that, you are actually empowering them to figure out what they need next. By acknowledging their experience in a lot of ways, the magical thing that happens with empathy is it kind of takes some pressure out of the tire. And once I feel heard, it's like my brain fog clears. And then I can begin to, okay, yeah, what do I need to do next? What do I need for help? Do I need any help? No, I can handle this on my own, right? And so that's the power of empathy. It's not rolling over and going soft and just letting people get away with being slap happy, right? It actually empowers people to identify what they need and what they need to do next. Empathy is the ultimate guardrail. It is the ultimate boundary guardrail, because if we stay in empathy when we are communicating with someone, it keeps us from over-functioning and picking up things that are not our responsibility, and it empowers the other person to identify what they need or what they need to do differently next time. Yes, 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 we want to help people, but we have to remember helping is defined by assisting someone who cannot do for themselves. Enabling is doing for others when they can do for themselves. We want to be helpers. We don't want to be enablers. Does that distinction make sense there? So let me give you another example, and then I promise I'm going to wrap up. Let me give you another example of why empathy is a powerful boundary in our relationships, in that it helps us not step into resentment, and it respects the other person. Okay, so let me give you another example. Let's say you and your friend are going on a trip, all right, and y'all are flying. And so you each have, we're going to do ladies. You each have like your purse, your carry-on bag, and your rolling suitcase, okay? And so you arrive at Hartsfield, you're going to walk the 5 miles, right, to the plane, and y'all you got the crossbody, you got the carry-on, and your rolling suitcases, all right? And your friend says, oh, I packed too much. My suitcase is so heavy. And you immediately say, oh, I'll roll it for you. And so your friend says, oh, okay, thank you. And so now you've got the crossbody purse, the carry-on, and you're rolling the 2 suitcases through Hartsfield, the 5 miles to the airplane. And then y'all get to Concourse B, you're still waiting to get to E or whatever, and your friend's like, oh, I think I'm going to get a cup of coffee. And so then you'll have to wait in line for the friend to get a cup of coffee. You also really were planning to get a cup of coffee, but you now have no hands to carry the coffee, right? Because you are rolling the suitcases the 5 miles to the plane. And so your friend gets her coffee. Oh, delicious. Yay, I have my coffee. You are now beginning to sweat, and you have no coffee. You're sweating. You're irritated. You're feeling resentful of a friend. You're wondering why you even agreed to go on this trip to begin with. And this is how you're starting your vacation, right? So in our example with the friend, So now some of you probably may be thinking, well, that friend sure was selfish. And, you know, by agreeing to let us roll her suitcase, and then she got the coffee, and that friend is just so inconsiderate and so self-absorbed and just so into herself, right? You can just kind of, but note, she didn't ask you to roll the suitcase. She didn't ask you to roll the suitcase. You swooped in trying to be helpful and kind, and she merely made a comment. Oh, I packed too much. My suitcase is so heavy. and you heard an ask, but she didn't ask. And that's something that I encourage you to kind of ponder and sit with. When you hear someone complain, or when you hear someone express a worry or a concern or a frustration, do you hear that as an ask when really they're just making a statement? But do you hear it as an ask, and then do you feel compelled to do something, right? Do you feel compelled to, I'll roll a suitcase, I'll climb the mountain, whatever it is, because you're trying to be kind when merely they were just making a comment. But it isn't kind if on the back end, you're hot and sweaty and full of resentment and judgment, right? And so again, it goes back to that original definition that we gave at the beginning of boundaries. Boundaries protect our worth and well-being. They protect who we are and who we want to be and how we want to show up in this world, which for most of us, we don't want to be frustrated, bothered, bitter, resentful people. Boundaries protect our kindness by keeping it pure and genuine. Empathy helps us stay within our boundaries to be kind, and empathy helps us stay out of resentment. And again, it's like Brene says, the most compassionate people are the most boundaried. Kindness without boundaries leads to enabling and overfunctioning in someone's life. It leads to waiting for someone to change and then feeling trapped because they won't change. It leads to sacrificing your needs for their wants. It leads you to paying the consequences for their actions. It leads to feeling taken advantage of. But at the same time, boundaries without kindness looks a lot like a grudge and a slammed door, right? Boundaries are not a means of getting even and settling the score and getting back at someone who has hurt us. The reality is, people are going to be difficult at times, and we are going to work with people who are challenging and who push our buttons, and we are going to live with people who are challenging and who push our buttons, and we are going to spend Christmas and Thanksgiving with people who are challenging and push our buttons, and we're going to have conflict, and this is just the nature of interacting with other human beings. And when we find ourselves in those situations, what we want to remember is that we don't have to go toe-to-toe. We don't have to go toe-to-toe in harshness. We don't have to puff up. We don't have to armor up ready for battle. Terry Real, who's an author and therapist that I'm a big fan of, he says, we don't meet harshness with harshness. We meet harshness with firm, loving kindness. We lead with kindness and we set boundaries. We can always be kind. We can always be kind. We can always be respectful to someone, and we can set boundaries. It is not punitive to hold someone accountable for their actions. It is not unkind to allow someone to experience the consequence of their action. We put boundaries in place to protect us, to protect our physical and our emotional well-being, and to protect our peace of mind, and to help us be the person that we want to be, so that our relationships don't pull us into pits that we don't want to be in. And so this topic, it may have stirred up a lot in you. And I'm going to say two things as I close. The topic of boundaries, I love to talk about it. It is relevant to all of our lives, personal and professional relationships. It is also a very nuanced topic. And so every situation is different, and every situation requires a different lens and a different perspective. And so it can be a tricky topic because things that I said today, they are general truths on empathy and boundary, but again, every situation is unique. The other thing that I want to say just in closing, just a little PSA, there are some relationships that we can stay in and jobs, that we can stay in, and we can adjust our expectations. We can adjust how we respond to someone. We can adjust the level of closeness we have with that person. But there are some relationships that are not salvageable. To stay in the relationship would be to sacrifice ourselves, and we are not called into that type of connection in our lives. That is not the connection that we are wired for. And each relationship and situation is different, and it is unique. And again, unfortunately, we can't just make blanket statements of you should do this and you should always do that and you should never do that. It just doesn't work that way. But the one thing that I can say that I do feel like is a blanket statement that I can say is that relationships, whether they are personal or professional, should not leave us feeling less than. Relationships should not leave us feeling unworthy. And the therapist in me has to say this: if you are in a relationship, personal and professional, in which that dynamic is in play, then something needs to change in the relationship. And I strongly encourage you to reach out for outside support in situations like that. It can just be so helpful to have a third party that you can talk with, that you can process, that you can vent, that you can things off of, that you can receive even just some relationship education from. Relationships are tricky, and it is just so helpful to have that extra space. So I wanted to say that in closing. But just in closing, kindness and boundaries can coexist. We want to always be kind, but we must always set boundaries that protect our worth and our well-being. Thank y'all so much for having me today. I have just so enjoyed getting to be with y'all. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And if I just want to I'm going to open my mouth first, because the reason I love this conversation so much is I struggle with boundaries. Enneagram 1 struggle with boundaries. That means maybe might struggle a little bit too. But especially, I loved her example, because something that I find as an Enneagram 1 with a big 2-wing, and as I talk with Mazi, my 2-wing exasperates my 1. So as a 1, I want to help people do the right thing. And of course, it's what I think is the right thing, not necessarily what they think is the right thing. And then as a 2, I want to help people for connection. This happens in my professional and my personal life. And so I'm so busy helping people. And I do. It's almost like I carry it as a badge of honor that I'm helping these people. And in so many circumstances, they don't want my help. It's not even that they didn't just ask me, like this person in the airport. They don't even want my help. So when I'm doing all this work to help them, it's also not making them happy. So I'm making myself unhappy, and I'm making them unhappy. And that's just another reason my boundaries are so important. And, I have a friend who is a 2 that I spend a lot of time with, and I'm like, you're always trying to help people, and half the time they don't want that help. It wears you out, and it also wears them out. So it is such a great lesson, I think, for a lot of people who do care about people. But, you have to care about people the way they want to be cared about.
Yeah, great point. Yes. Anybody, any questions?
Raymond, do we have any online, any questions?
I told them they could ask, haven't gotten any yet.
Okay.
If this is a topic that you are interested in, or you felt like some of the things I shared resonate with you, I would encourage you to listen to the last 2. They're the 2 most recent episodes of Brene Brown's podcast, Unlocking Us. She talks about this concept that she calls living big. And BIG is an acronym for boundaries, integrity, and generosity. And it flows right in with things that we have been talking about here today. But it's the last 2, the 2 most recent episodes of Unlocking Us, which is only on Spotify. But those 2 episodes are excellent. So if you are, as you drive home, if you have anything you want to listen to.
What was the person's name?
Brene Brown. And the podcast is Unlocking Us on Spotify.
What did you say big stood for? Boundaries?
Integrity and generosity.
We have a question from someone online.
Okay.
Do you have any advice for Enneagram 6s to learn what boundaries are best to have, especially when some of us are people pleasers, to keep ourselves secure?
Yes, that is a big question. And I think for Enneagram 6, with 6s, fear plays a big part in their lives. And so with an Enneagram 6, I would encourage them to really spend some time identifying what is it that I'm afraid will happen if I set this boundary? What is it that I'm afraid will happen if I say no, if I speak up, if I give my opinion, if I say, no, I don't want to go to lunch there today? What is the root fear? Because fear is most definitely a barrier to boundary setting.
For some of us that don't know or have Enneagrams, can you explain a little bit?
Yes, so Enneagram is a personality concept methodology. It's a way of conceptualizing personalities. And so there are 9 Enneagram types. Literally the numbers 1, 2, 3, and each number stands for a different thing. And so it is different, but it's a similar thing to like Myers-Briggs or DISC. It's been around for literally centuries. I think it was whoever, I can't even remember who came up with Enneagram, but they were like a monk in like 400s or something crazy like that. And so in recent years, it has had a real resurgence in popularity, and it is a great way just to conceptualize our personalities, and again, we don't want to label ourselves, and it isn't a labeling system. It is a way of just understanding our internal motivations, why we do certain things, why we respond the way we do. And so it can just be very helpful in developing self-awareness, particularly in our relationships.
Does that tie into like the temperament thing that we learned
So
several years
it's a
ago?
lot, and I mean, and of course, I think Mazi, you know who Kathleen Edelman is,
Mhm.
and she's talking about this. So Kathleen was here, gosh, it seems like yesterday, but it was before the pandemic. I said this, you heard that. So for me, the reason I love the Enneagram so much, and and I have been, as you guys listen to me, and many of you too, I've been on a self-awareness journey, and I've done Myers-Briggs, and I never really found it a lot of use. That doesn't mean somebody else doesn't find that much more useful, but the reason I love the Enneagram is it's, I have a very close friend who's a 3, and she and I display, most people seeing us would be like, oh, those two are just alike. And the things that come out of our mouth sometimes are just like, and then she and I like dive deep down to what caused us to say those. And let me tell you, it's not the same. And that's why I love the Enneagram. The Enneagram is not really about how you show, but it's about your inward motivation. It's what makes you react the way that you do. And so, for example, like for me,
So the temperament's kind of like tied to that.
yeah, but it's like, why am I helping people? I'm helping people. So an Enneagram 2 is helping people because that's how they get connection. I'm helping people because I want the world to be a good place. I want it to be right, or even another way I would say it is in perfect order. And I can help people get it into that order. But when you learn that about yourself and you see, okay, my version of right and Mazi, so Mazi and I might both be a 1, but we both have different versions of right. So it's really helped me see just those. It is just a self-awareness thing, and it delves very deep. Raymond, you have somebody with a question?
Yeah, we got a couple more questions online.
Mhm.
If you're setting boundaries with pre-existing relationships, is it best that the other person know you're setting them, or do you just set them?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. And I would say it depends on the situation. And let me explain what I mean by that. There are relationships in which it is important to say, hey, I noticed this, and when you do this, I feel this, and I just want to let you know that moving forward, I'm going to make some changes and I'm going to start doing X and Y. In some relationships, it is important to have that conversation. What I would say is that you want to make sure that the relationship is one in which it is safe to verbalize that boundary, because to verbalize a boundary is actually a very vulnerable thing. And so can the relationship bear the weight of the share? Another way of saying that, if you verbalize that boundary, if you share that, if you are vulnerable in that way, can that person hear that? Or is it going to turn into an explosion? What do you mean? And they're going to get defensive and blah, 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 blah. If it is a situation where, no, the relationship can't bear the weight of the share just because we actually aren't that close, or that person has not, doesn't have awareness, or they wouldn't respond in a productive way, then we just let our actions do the talking. And so it really just depends on the safety, the closeness, how comfortable we feel being vulnerable in the relationship as to whether or not we verbalize the boundary or we just begin to behave differently, act differently. Yeah. Edwin, was there another question?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a comment that's more of a comment, but it really fits with what you were saying. Somebody said a phrase that has helped me to set boundaries for myself and not try to solve other people's problems is, "Are you looking for feedback or do you just want to vent?"
Oh,
So that's
yeah,
a very,
I love that. And it is so true. Yes, and that can be so helpful to ask in our personal and our professional lives. Are you looking for feedback right now? Or are you just wanting to vent? Yes, yes, yes.
Then there's one more question online. Someone said, specifically in my professional life, I have been questioned regarding my boundaries. Do you have suggestions for positive ways to communicate when a person is persistent in their questioning?
That one might be a little hard for me to answer because how has this person been questioned regarding their boundaries?
Yeah. I don't have the details at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that one, I think without more information, I don't know if I can answer that because has the person been questioned because they don't have strong enough boundaries or they're too bad? Because, we could really go deep here. Because you can be boundaryless, meaning you do not have good boundaries, meaning, and again, that can look like being a doormat, always saying yes, or over-functioning, overstepping. You can also be walled off where you are too boundaried and you are so boundary that it is impossible to connect with you. So there is an overcorrection that can happen with boundaries where we become walled off, closed off, constantly armored up, highly defensive. And that is as problematic in our relationships as being boundaryless.
And that's why we need people like Mazi, because this balance can be very hard to obtain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else?
I just have a comment. I had a situation and I called Christopher and he gave me exactly what I needed. He listened, he was supportive, and he showed me empathy. And he let me handle it from there.
That's wonderful.
And it was spot on.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And you felt seen and you felt heard and you felt supported and you felt empowered to figure out what you need to do next.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Does this, as far as setting boundaries and, are there things that you would have to do differently with a high functioning autistic person in a relationship like this?
Yes.
Where there needs to be boundaries?
Right. Yes. And what I would say, and that is certainly a unique situation. And I think what I would say there is consistency is really important. Consistency is really important in all of our relationships when it comes to boundaries, but also when you're dealing with someone who has some other special needs issues that might be going on, that consistency and being consistent in what you accept or what you tolerate, what you say yes, what you say no to, can be very, very helpful because it just sets that consistent expectation. And that is a very short and oversimplified answer to a question that has many, many layers to it. But yes.
This is really just a comment that I have a friend who's very good at setting boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't really use that word necessarily. What
Yeah.
she'll say is, no is just a very important word
Mhm.
in your vocabulary. And she says everybody needs margin
Yes.
and that you get that by the boundaries you set. And I just thought I would share that because that way of viewing it is you need margin helps me with boundaries.
I love that. And it's a great image of like, yes, I'm going to set these boundaries. I'm going to have these guardrails. So there's a little extra space here, if something comes up or, like with our schedules and, that's great.
I know for me, I get asked to volunteer for a lot of different things in my personal life. And I have had to say, well, this is the main thing that I do here because I also work. And
Yes.
I cannot manage all of this other stuff that you would like me to volunteer to do. And so once I made that decision, that made everything so easy.
Yeah.
It's easy then to set can't do that, this is a boundary, that's probably not.
That's a great example. That is a great example. Yeah.
So maybe when you want to say no, should you also feel compelled to explain why you're saying no, or should you just say no?
Well,
And
and
not have the guilt that goes along with it.
and yes, that's a great question. What we always hear is that no is a complete sentence. And what I encourage people to think about is if you want to keep talking after you say no, what's going on there? What is that internal motivation? You know, if you feel like, no, unfortunately, I can't. If you feel that that isn't sufficient, what is the story you're telling yourself that that isn't sufficient? And again, not to go too deep and then blast out of here, but oftentimes our need to over-explain is a trauma response. It is a way of protecting ourselves. If I really over-explain, if I give you every possible reason why this won't work out and why I chose to do this, and it is a way of self-protecting. And so it's important to recognize that, like, I feel compelled to add 3 paragraphs on why I'm saying no. What is it that I'm afraid is going to happen that I'm feeling the need to self-protect in this way? Rather than, no, unfortunately, I can't. Yes.
So I know there's a lot of people in the room who supervise, and setting boundaries with staff that report directly to you can be kind of tricky, especially if you have staff who, would maybe like for you to provide them with all the answers, and your goal is to empower them to make great decisions. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about like where you see boundary setting kind of rubbing up against something like coaching, or like drawing good decision making out of your team in a way that you're not offering to do the work for them, but you are also supporting them in and guiding.
Yes, great question. And I think with things like coaching and mentoring, there have to be such clear boundaries, because otherwise it is just open field for overstepping and enabling and carrying other people's suitcases that they need to learn to carry their own suitcase or not pack so much, right? Right. And so yes, I think having boundaries in when you're a supervisor and in that role is very important. And that really starts with you. You set the tone of how much people are going to ask of you, how much people are, this makes people sound manipulative. I don't mean that. So this isn't a great phrase, but how much people are going to try to take from you. Again, that's not a great phrase, but I think y'all know what I mean. And so I think it is important of, okay, how am I going to, and to even think ahead, how do I want to handle when requests are made of me, or when someone comes to me with a complaint or a concern, or they're unhappy about something? Well, I want to lead with empathy first. And then I want to get curious. I want to gather more data. I want to gather more information. And so I'm going to ask them some questions about this or that. And then I'm going to ask them, how might I be of support to you? Rather than immediately jumping, because I'm sure you have been in your role longer than they've been in their role probably. And so I'm sure that you can see, all right, you need to turn left and then you need to turn right, sort of thing. And so it would be very easy for you to, okay, I did what the lady with the strange name said. I was empathetic and then I was curious. And so it would be very easy to then just be like, well, I think what you need to do is blah, 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 blah. But to set, it's almost like a boundary with yourself of, no, I'm going to stay right here and I'm going to ask, how might I be of support to you? Because again, you're tossing, the boundary is that you're tossing the ball back to them, right? I see you, I hear you. Now I'm going to get curious. Tell me more about the situation. Tell me more about your concern. Tell me more about what's bothering you. How can I help? So and by tossing the ball back and forth, you are empowering them to figure out what it is that do they need. Do they actually need help, or did they really just need 15 minutes to vent? And if they do need help, what is that help? And so that's the boundary of continuously tossing it back to help them figure out what it is that they need. And then to say, okay, I need you to do, it would be helpful if X, Y, and Z could happen. And then, all right, I hear what you're saying there. Let me look into Z. I think we can follow through with X. We'll have a follow-up meeting in a week, right? And so you're not over-promising. You're not jumping to save. You see kind of those little boundaries that we set. Does that help? Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
I was just gonna say that, when you put up the 4 blocks of the what it sounds like, librarians get trained on something called the reference interview. And this kind of has a sound like that, where we're trained to kind of like listen and repeat back what we think we heard the person say. And as we're saying it, the person's hearing what it sounded like and correcting, oh, no, that's not what I meant. And then we repeat it back again until we get it right to them, how it was supposed to sound, until we say it right. And then we can start looking for exactly what the person is coming in to get to the correct information. And I think that's kind of what this sounds like, how we get to how we can help them. And like you just said, that we get to, okay, how can I help you move along in that coaching piece? And I'm not going to give you the answers. You're going to kind of come up with it yourself, and then we can move along. So, and I like that because I kind of like goes along with how we were trained as librarians.
Yeah.
Like we're not really, just jumping in and say, oh, no, I know you need a James Patterson book. Just wait and let them kind of help us get to that.
Yes. Based on the way that you described that, it absolutely does go in line with that. And that's an important thing to remember, for a lot of people when they practice that reflective listening, those empathetic responses of, it sounds like you're feeling stressed. It sounds like you're feeling frustrated. One of the struggles people can have is, oh, but what if I get it wrong? And then I'm going to feel embarrassed that I got it wrong. But that's not it at all. If they say, no, I'm not frustrated. I'm just sad today. Like, I hear that. Yes, because you were still helpful in the moment because you helped them clarify, no, I'm not frustrated. I'm actually sad today. And that's helpful, right? And so, yes, that reflective listening, we feel like we're not doing enough in the moment, but it is actually so effective. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me.